Rising temperatures and increasingly frequent weather disasters like droughts and floods are forcing more and more people around the world to leave their homes and communities, sometimes permanently. This isn't an issue for the distant future. 26.4 million natural disaster-related displacements were recorded around the world in 2023 alone, the third highest annual total in the past decade. Today we have Julia Blocher on the podcast to discuss the intersection of climate change and migration. Julia is a visiting scholar at the Blocher Institute Center for the Middle East, as well as a project lead and scientist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Her research explores the social, political, and environmental dimensions of climate-related human mobility. We'll explore the phenomenon of climate migration and the steps governments are taking or not taking in response. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Blocher Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Blocher Briefing. Julia, thank you for joining us today. Now, your research is centered around climate mobility. What does that term mean? Why is it relevant now for governments and the international community at large?
Well, first of all, Ambassador Satterfield, thank you for having me on the pod, and also thanks for having me as a visiting scholar at Blocher. It's been a fantastic experience so far. When it comes to climate mobility, there are a lot of different terms that are floating around and not really any consensus on which term is the best to use or even what the definitions of some of these terms are. But I tend to use climate mobility as an umbrella term to refer to migration, which is a mostly voluntary movement of people, displacement, which is a forced movement of people, and planned relocations, which is a government-supported relocation of communities away from climate-related hazards. These three types of mobility, migration, displacement, and planned relocations, appear in politically negotiated texts from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change discussions since 2011 in the Cancun Adaptation Framework. So because these are politically agreed terms, it makes it easier for me to use this in my research and also then in policy discussions. These types of movements have been identified by governments agreeing to address it through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as by the international scientific communities through the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, first identifying this as a concern in 1990 as a possible outcome of climate change.
But given all of this, these definitions that exist, why do researchers find it difficult to establish a causal relationship between migration, movement, and climate change? Why isn't it clearer?
It's a really good point, and thank you for raising it. So much of the climate mobility literature essentially conceives of climate change as having an indirect effect on migration and displacement. And this is because we stress that migration is a multi-causal and a very complex social behavior. It's a human behavior. This is because those individual factors that we know are related to migration probabilities, like gender, age, status in the household, and socioeconomic status, are mediated by household and community level factors. For example, having access to roads or transportation, having access to visas and other political facilitators of migration. All of these are really important in whether or not a person, whether they have the aspiration to migrate or not, can actually migrate. So, for example, in my research in Tanzania and Ethiopia, we assessed climate change as a sort of second-order impact on the migration of people from rural areas by identifying the process through which climate change affects the household agricultural production and food security, and so there is indirectly related to outmigration for food insecure families.
If I could ask, and we'll take the example of East Africa, which is an excellent and long-standing one. Going back 40 plus years, the impact of repeated severe drought in East Africa, Horn and East Africa, has been a well-known phenomenon. It's almost a half-century extant. When people think of migration as a function of climate change, I think looming in most people's minds is drought, its impact on agriculture and animal husbandry for those communities entirely dependent on those sources of income, and their forced migration, forced in the sense of inability to survive without moving to other less affected areas. Is this, in fact, a valid model for the majority of climate-induced migration today?
Absolutely. I think that a lot of researchers would say that that is the bottom of the iceberg, in the sense that we have good numbers of people who are forced to flee disasters for their lives. This is what we would consider disaster displacement. So we have annual numbers of that because governments record that, and then it's compiled by a global body. But we don't know how many people are moving because of those slow onset events like repeated droughts, environmental degradation more broadly, soil degradation, sea level rise, and so on, even though we do think that this is an increasingly increasingly important driver of migration around the world. My recent research published last year on these cumulative effects of the impacts of climate change on households and outmigration over time really kind of points to what you could consider a tipping point for migration, where communities may be able to withstand a number of shocks over time, but those climatic and environmental shocks that are successive, repeated, and all correlated together with non-environmental co-stressors bring people to a point at which they have little other coping mechanism available to them than to leave.
And the distinction between forced and voluntary climate-induced migration, what is the distinction? Why is it important?
Yes, this is really important for legal and political reasons primarily. We tend to associate forced migration with those sudden onset events like floods and wildfires, which are the proximate cause of a person's movement, while with voluntary migration, meaning there's some elements of agency, a person tends to be experiencing a slow onset event like a drought or land degradation. And this is traditionally the way that we divide things in the literature because there are humanitarian responses that can be associated with forced migration, whereas voluntary migration requires a longer-term development response and also climate change adaptation
Joy,
responses.
if you'd had to look around the world today, has the pattern been a greater incidence by numbers of migration as a result of what you have described as the slow or repeated incidents of drought, sea level changes, inability to survive in places where individuals were, vice the episodic natural disaster?
It's a really important question to consider when we're trying to look into policy responses for the future. But I do want to also point out that this dichotomy between forced and voluntary migration tends not to hold up on the ground. We like to conceive more of a continuum between types of migration that are more voluntary and then those types of migration that are more forced. But coming to the question of what is the trend we're observing, the 10-year average for persons displaced by disasters was 21.9 million people displaced by weather-related events per year, and that's increasing as compared to the previous 10-year average. So we're pretty certain that because of the well-established increased incidence and intensity of extreme weather events, more people are being displaced and will be in the future.
Now, that's a very interesting observation, which I think will be counterintuitive to most of our listeners, who would believe more people have moved over the last decade as a result of repeated drought, permanent or near permanent climate change that has made it impossible for them to live than have moved because of specific date-fixed events. You're saying no. It's the specific natural disasters have induced more individuals to move than prolonged phenomenon, sea level rise, or drought?
Well, not exactly, because we do have good numbers of the people who were displaced, so we can see that those numbers are increasing. When it comes to these more permanent but slowly developing environmental crises as sea level rise or land degradation, we're not able to have good numbers on that. There's a lot of data gaps around the world. And as you mentioned earlier, there's this issue that climate change is just one factor among many for why people may migrate over time. So even if we believe that those numbers are increasing, we haven't managed to establish good counts of them so far.
Which groups are most vulnerable to climate change-induced migration or movement?
Well, I think there's a few different layers to be considered. That there is an issue of global inequality, and those countries that are most vulnerable to climate change tend to also be those that have the least capacities to address it. So those groups of people are also most vulnerable. But we also have within-country inequality that dictates who is most vulnerable to climate change impacts. So I think you can think of climate change as adding to kind of a toxic cocktail for poor and marginalized people, by which the structural vulnerabilities that put people, and especially minorities or people in poverty, at disproportionate exposure to climate change impacts are also those who have few capabilities to face those impacts. So my research in Africa, but also in the Caribbean and the Pacific, suggests that it's really rarely those wealthier strata of people who migrate first or are able to access evacuation options and so on, but rather the poorest and most vulnerable people that are most at risk.
Habitability, social tipping points. What do they mean? How are they connected?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking this question. One of my latest pieces of research is about how do we define habitability and how can we connect this to tipping points. We define habitability as the sociocultural, economic, and environmental factors that shape the suitability of a place to support human life and livelihoods. So my recent research on this topic in 6 countries in Africa and in Asia, we sought to explore whether there might be kind of a critical mass of people that leave a place to such an extent that it makes life practically impossible for the people who are remaining to be there, and then everyone more or less may have to leave. There would be a social tipping point to the extent that that place would be uninhabitable. And this has been observed in some of my other research in India and in Tanzania. We've seen what we would call ghost villages, or what the locals call ghost villages. However, in our recent research, when we explored this, we kind of found that there's not necessarily a large geographic area that becomes uninhabitable, but rather that this is defined at the community and household level because habitability is socially differentiated. People with more resources, better social connections, more ability to invest in migration and in diversification of livelihoods are less likely to reach that tipping point than people who have more limited capacities.
The climate migrant as a victim of circumstance. What agency has your research found, if any, do those migrants have?
Absolutely. This is a really important point, especially in East Africa, where most of my research is based, because mobility in general and different types of migration has forever been an adaptation mechanism. I've done a lot of research with Maasai communities in Kenya and in Tanzania. Mobility defines their community resilience and their ability to face shocks, including climate shocks. So this picture of people migrating because they have no other option does not always hold true empirically. And also, frankly, is a dangerous discursive tool. We've seen in other pieces of research this idea of mass migration prompted by climate change as directly linked to right-wing agendas and anti-migrant sentiment and also anti-migrant violence. So we have to be really careful when we paint migrants as being victims because the stakes are high.
Bringing things to the United States, the effect of climate-induced or climate-magnified disasters, the LA fires, the effect of increasingly frequent and more violent hurricanes on populations along the Gulf Coast. All of this has produced a certain degree of willful movement, although some has been offset by continued government policies which provide an incentive or remove a moral hazard for communities to continue living in areas where one might say they ought not, based upon climatic realities. How do governments deal with this, not in the East Africa world, but in the developed world?
It's a really important point, I think, especially that we know that wealthy countries are not immune to the impacts of climate change. And recent events observed in the United States show that even the wealthiest countries are not immune to the impacts of climate change, and much more needs to be done to ensure that these risks that are related to climate-related hazards, as well as more gradual changes, don't continue to affect the poorest and most marginalized people within the country. In the United States, we observed over the past 10 years, 9 million people displaced by disasters, floods, storms, and wildfires. And I think there's a common misconception that wealthy countries don't experience these events, but quite the opposite, that it's ongoing and that in financial terms, wealthy countries bear the biggest brunt of disasters. In the United States, Helene and Milton last year were the most expensive disasters worldwide if you consider financial terms. In human terms, what is troubling to me is this increasing number of Americans that are essentially deprived of that choice to rebuild or to relocate because they simply lack the resources to continue their livelihoods as before. And we've seen in the recent fires in Southern California, but also in previous disasters like Hurricane Katrina, that it's the lowest socioeconomic strata that feel these disasters most strongly and are less able to rebuild afterwards. And also, unfortunately, the mortality rates of those people are higher, and they tend to evacuate at lower rates and so on. So it's across the board that this is an issue that needs to be addressed in the U.S. as well.
Has your research also contemplated, you referenced Katrina, the government policy position of communities built on floodplains, where the experience of most of modern history has indicated their housing not just would be, but has been repeatedly subject to destruction or significant damage, yet insurance continues to be issued which permits rebuilding, as opposed to a complete rethinking of floodplains development. This is true for Houston, of course, as well, has not been applied because it would have a disproportionate impact on lower socioeconomic groups. How do you break this cycle of continuing to build where one ought not, based either upon modern climatic data or the better part of a century's worth, Houston, of climatic data?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I think as a social scientist, the first thing that comes to my mind is place attachment and the fact that a lot of people would prefer to stay in risky areas, even if they're told that they should not. And we see this in the U.S. and Louisiana and in Houston, but also around the world, that people feel a lot of attachment to their ancestral land, but also the place where they've maybe built their lives and livelihoods. When it comes to providing insurance options, it's not really my area, but I have a number of colleagues that work on attribution science, which is a really rapidly expanding field where we're able to more directly connect the impacts of climate change to specific weather events especially, but specific impacts of climate change. Like, for example, that this panel of scientists suggests that when we experienced Hurricane Helene, that the winds were 13 miles per hour faster and there was 10% more precipitation than would have occurred for the same storm if we were at a natural average of temperature at that time when Hurricane Helene hit. So if we can somehow connect better this attribution science with the insurers, we can more easily, I think, identify areas that will become more and more difficult to inhabit.
Again, here at home in Houston, there will soon be a new debate or an old debate revived on all the factors you just discussed when the floodplain maps are released, 400, 200, 100, 50, 20, 10-year maps, which will provide quite an interesting picture of how the risk from storms and flooding has increased dramatically since the last such maps were released to the public and to the insurance industry. This is not a topic going away anytime soon or that is distant from the lives of our listeners or Americans in general. It is something with which all aspects of society, the economic world, the construction world, city planners, all will have to deal or face increasingly severe consequences. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Ambassador. It was a pleasure.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel with support from Megan Foreman. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thanks for listening.